Hit in the winter of 1856, in a remote corner of southeastern Ohio, 3 newborn boys entered the world under circumstances so extraordinary that medical professionals still debate their case in hushed tones today. Born in the hidden basement of a Quaker meeting house during one of the most dangerous nights in Underground Railroad history, these triplets developed abilities that defied every known law of human psychology and physiology. For over a century, their descendants have guarded secrets about what those boys could do. Secrets that, if revealed, would force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the limits of human perception. What I'm about to share with you has never been told outside the family records, never documented in any official medical journal, and never spoken of in any academic circle. The evidence has been deliberately buried, but tonight the truth finally comes to light. Before we dive deeper into this chilling account that begins in the shadows of America's most secretive rescue network, I need to know something about you. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge the very foundations of what we believe possible. If you're one of the few who can handle stories that blur the line between documented history and inexplicable phenomena, hit that subscribe button right now. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me what state you're listening from. I want to know where my fellow mystery seekers are gathering tonight, because what you're about to hear happened not in some distant mystical land, but right here in America, in communities that might be disturbingly close to your own. The story I'm about to tell you began on a bitter February night when 3 lives entered this world in the most unlikely place imaginable, setting in motion events that would perplex doctors and scientists for generations to come. The town of Cedar Mills, Ohio, barely deserved the name in 1856, with a population hovering around 300 souls. It consisted of little more than a cluster of modest homes, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and the simple brick meeting house that served the local Quaker community. Unlike their more demonstrative Christian neighbors, the Society of Friends in Cedar Mills practiced their faith quietly, their plain dress and solemn demeanor reflecting a deep commitment to simplicity and, most importantly, to the radical belief that all human beings were equal in the eyes of God. This conviction had transformed their meeting house into something far more dangerous than a place of worship. It had become Station 14 on the Underground Railroad, a crucial stop for freedom seekers making their way north from Kentucky and Virginia. Elder Samuel Whitmore, a man whose weathered hands spoke of decades working the soil and whose piercing gray eyes held secrets that could hang half the congregation, had been conducting this clandestine work for nearly 8 years. Beneath the meeting house's plain wooden floors lay a carefully concealed basement, accessed through a trapdoor hidden beneath the speaker's platform. The basement itself was a marvel of desperate engineering. Dug by hand over months of careful work, it stretched nearly the full length of the building above. Thick wooden beams supported the ceiling, while ventilation came through an ingenious system of hollow fence posts that appeared decorative, but carried fresh air to those hiding below. On any given week, Anywhere from 3 to 15 freedom seekers might shelter there, some for a single night, others for weeks, as they waited for safe passage to the next station. February of 1856 had been particularly treacherous. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had emboldened slave catchers who now roamed freely through Ohio with legal authority to reclaim human property. Professional bounty hunters, like the notorious Garrett brothers, had been spotted in the area for weeks, offering substantial rewards for information about underground railroad operations. The tension in Cedar Mills was so thick you could almost taste it. Every unexpected visitor, every knock at the door after dark, every unusual sound could signal discovery and imprisonment. It was against this backdrop of fear and secrecy that a young woman had arrived at the meeting house 3 days earlier. She had given her name only as Ruth, claimed to be 19 years old, and was obviously with child, very much with child. Samuel Whitmore had taken one look at her swollen belly and known immediately that she wouldn't be traveling any further north for quite some time. What he hadn't expected was just how soon that child would arrive, or how profoundly its arrival would change everything they thought they knew about human nature. Ruth had come from a plantation in northern Kentucky. She told them in whispered conversations during her first nights in the basement. She spoke with the careful diction of someone who had been taught to read, unusual for someone in her circumstances, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed even the stoic Quakers. But there was something else about her, something that made people uneasy without quite understanding why. She seemed to know things, small things, but disturbing in their accuracy. She would know when someone was approaching the meeting house long before any sound could be heard. She would refuse. Food that later proved to be spoiled, though it had appeared perfectly fresh. Most unsettling of all, she would sometimes look directly at whoever was speaking, and quietly contradict their words, not argumentatively, but with the calm certainty of someone who simply knew better. That man who brought the supplies yesterday, she had said to Samuel's wife, Martha, on her second evening there. He told you his name was Williams, didn't he? And that he was from Lancaster. Martha had nodded, confused. His name isn't Williams, Ruth had continued, her voice barely above a whisper. And he's never been to Lancaster in his life. I don't know why he lied to you, but he did. Martha had dismissed this as the paranoid rambling of a frightened, pregnant woman until 2 days later, when the man's real identity was discovered. He was indeed using a false name and had been asking suspicious questions about the meeting house's activities. The night of February 23rd, 1856, began like many others in Cedar Mills, cold, dark, and deceptively quiet. Samuel Whitmore had been conducting his evening prayers when a soft knock came at the meeting house door, followed by the agreed-upon signal. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. But something felt wrong from the moment Samuel lifted the heavy wooden beam that barred the door. The freedom seeker who stumbled inside was a man named Joshua, someone Samuel had helped before. But Joshua's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic. "They're coming," Joshua gasped, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "The Garrett brothers, and at least 6 others. They've got dogs, and they know about this place. Someone talk." He paused, his eyes darting toward the basement entrance. "There may be 2 hours behind me, probably less." Samuel felt his blood turned to ice. In 8 years of underground railroad work, they had never faced a direct threat like this. The meeting house had always been considered safe, protected by the community's reputation for honesty and their careful operational security. But if the Garretts were coming with dogs and advanced knowledge of the basement, someone had indeed betrayed them. The immediate problem was evacuation. There were currently 7 people sheltering in the basement, including Ruth, who had been experiencing intermittent labor pains for most of the day. Martha Whitmore had been monitoring her condition, but had hoped the birth wouldn't come for at least another week. Mother Nature, however, seemed to have other plans. As if summoned by Joshua's words, a low moan echoed from beneath the floorboards. Martha's face went pale. "Samuel," she whispered, "Ruth's time has come. Right now." The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare carved from ice and fear. While Samuel and 2 other men worked frantically to evacuate the other 6 freedom seekers through the meeting house's hidden northern tunnel. A hand-dug passage that emerged, nearly a quarter-mile away, in a dense grove of oak trees. Martha and her daughter Rebecca descended into the basement to attend to Ruth's labor. What they found in that cramped, dimly lit space challenged every assumption they held about childbirth. Ruth was indeed in active labor, but something was profoundly wrong. She was experiencing none of the usual signs of distress or pain that accompanied difficult births. Instead, she lay perfectly still on the rough straw mattress, her eyes closed, her breathing steady and controlled. When contractions came, she didn't cry out or even tense her muscles. She simply waited, as if listening to something only she could put here. "How many babies?" Martha asked, pressing her ear to Ruth's swollen belly in the traditional way of midwives. Ruth's eyes opened for the first time in an hour. In the flickering candlelight, they seemed almost luminous. 3, she said simply. 3 boys. They've been waiting for tonight." Martha exchanged a worried glance with her daughter. Triplets were rare enough under the best circumstances, but triplets born in a hidden basement, while slave catchers approached with bloodhounds, was a situation beyond anything in her experience. More troubling was Ruth's certainty about the baby's gender and her strange comment about them waiting. How could unborn children wait for anything? The sound of horses in the distance cut through Martha's confusion. Samuel's voice called down, "From above. They're here. The tunnel's clear, but we can't risk moving Ruth now." What happened next was recorded in Martha Whitmore's private journal, a document that remained hidden in her family for over a century before being discovered in 2003 during the renovation of an old farmhouse. According to her account, written just days after the events, Ruth's labor accelerated dramatically the moment the slave catchers arrived at the meeting house. But it accelerated in a way that defied medical understanding. The first baby was born in complete silence. No crying, No sound at all, except for Ruth's barely audible breathing. Martha caught the infant, a perfectly formed boy, and was startled to find him already breathing normally, his eyes open and alert. Before she could even cut the umbilical cord, the second baby arrived again in total silence, again breathing, and aware from the moment of birth. The third followed less than a minute later, completing what Martha described as the most unnatural natural birth I have ever witnessed. But the strangest part was yet to come. As Martha worked to clean and wrap the 3 infants, footsteps and voices could be heard directly above them. The Garrett brothers had entered the meeting house and were conducting a thorough search. Heavy boots walked across the wooden floors just feet above the newborns' heads. At one point, someone stood directly on the trapdoor that concealed the basement entrance. Throughout this entire time, with strange men and tracking dogs just above them, the 3 babies never made a sound. Not a cry, not a whimper, not even the small noises that all newborns make. They lay perfectly still in their mother's arms, their identical dark eyes moving back and forth, as if following the movement of the searches above. It was as if they somehow understood that their survival depended on absolute silence. Ruth never spoke during the search. According to Martha's journal, she simply held her 3 sons and whispered to them in a language that sounded like no dialect Martha had ever heard. Later, Martha would describe it as words that seemed to flow like water, soft and continuous, like a river running over stones. The search lasted nearly 3 hours. The Garretts were thorough, methodical, and increasingly frustrated. They checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding placeable. Their dogs sniffed around the meeting house's foundation, and even scratched at the floorboards in several places, but they never found the entrance to the basement. And eventually they left, cursing their informant for providing bad information. It was only after the sounds of horses had faded completely into the distance that the 3 babies finally made their first sounds. And when they did, all 3 cried in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single haunting wail that seemed to echo from the very walls of the basement. Ruth died less than an hour later, bleeding that Martha couldn't stop, despite all her experience with difficult births. Her last words, spoken so quietly that Martha had to lean close to hear them, were, "They'll know things. They'll always know. Take care of them, but remember they're not like other children." The death of Ruth left the Quaker community of Cedar Mills facing an impossible situation. 3 newborn boys with no known father, no family, and no legal existence. Slave children born free on Ohio soil, but with no documentation to prove their status. Samuel Whitmore made the decision that would shape the rest of his life. The community would raise the boys collectively, each family taking turns caring for them, but all sharing responsibility for their upbringing. The boys were named by the community in the Quaker tradition: Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. From their earliest days, it was clear that Ruth's final words had been more than the ravings of a dying woman. The 3 boys were indeed not like other children. but in ways that were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence by anyone not watching closely. Martha Whitmore, who had taken primary responsibility for the boys' care during their first year, began keeping detailed notes about their behavior. These notes, discovered along with her birth journal, provide a disturbing glimpse into the early manifestations of the boys' unusual abilities. At 6 months old, the triplets had developed a habit that unnerved their caregivers. They would all turn their heads in the same direction at exactly the same moment, often focusing on empty doorways or windows where no one was visible. When someone eventually appeared in those locations, sometimes minutes later, it was always a person who was upset, angry, or hiding something. The boys seemed to sense emotional distress long before any adult could detect it. By their first birthday, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The triplets could identify lies with unerring accuracy. When community members spoke to them, the boys would respond normally to truthful statements, but would turn away and refuse to engage with anyone who was being dishonest, even about trivial matters. At first, the adults found this amusing, even helpful. If someone claimed to have completed a chore they'd actually forgotten, the boys would immediately know. If a visitor to the meeting house gave a false name or misleading information about their background, the triplets would become agitated and refused to go near that person. The ability was more than simple lie detection. As the boys grew older, they seemed to sense deception in all its forms, not just spoken lies, but hidden intentions, concealed emotions, and unspoken plans. Samuel Whitmore wrote in his private correspondence, "It is as if the boys can see directly into the human heart and know what lies therein. This would be a blessing, perhaps, if it did not seem to cause them such distress. They are constantly aware of the small falsehoods and hidden thoughts that all people carry, and this knowledge appears to be a burden rather than a gift." More disturbing were the boys' reactions to specific types of deception. They showed particular distress around anyone who was hiding information about missing persons or concealed violence. During their second year, a traveling merchant named Thompson stopped at the meeting house, claiming to be heading to Columbus on business. The triplets became so agitated in his presence that they couldn't sleep or eat until he left. 2 weeks later, news arrived that Thompson had been arrested for the murder of his business partner, whose body had been concealed in Thompson's wagon during his visit to Cedar Mills. By age 3, the boys had developed what the community began calling the knowing look, a shared expression they would adopt when focusing on someone who was hiding something significant. All 3 would turn their heads simultaneously, their dark eyes seeming to penetrate whoever had attracted their attention. Most unsettling was their habit of whispering to each other during these episodes, always in that strange, flowing language that Ruth had used during their birth. Dr. William Harrison, the local physician who had been monitoring the boys' development, was both fascinated and disturbed by their abilities. In a letter to a colleague at the Medical College of Ohio, he wrote, "I have examined these children repeatedly and can find no physical abnormality that would account for their unusual perceptive abilities. Their hearing, vision, and other senses appear normal, though perhaps slightly more acute than average. Yet they consistently demonstrate knowledge of matters that should be beyond their perception. I am forced to conclude that either these children possess some form of sensory capacity unknown to medical science, or I am the victim of an elaborate deception. Though how 3-year-old children could maintain such a deception is beyond my understanding. The boys' impact on the Underground Railroad operations was immediate and profound. Word of their abilities spread quietly through the network of stations and conductors. Freedom seekers began requesting specifically to be routed through Cedar Mills, knowing that the boys could identify infiltrators and betrayers with perfect accuracy. The Triplets' presence in the meeting house basement became a guarantee of safety. If they remained calm and peaceful, the freedom seekers knew they were among friends. If the boys became agitated or refused to enter the basement, it was a certain sign that someone in the group couldn't be trusted. Samuel Whitmore found himself in the uncomfortable position of relying on 3 young children for the security of one of Ohio's most important Underground Railroad stations. But the boys' accuracy was undeniable. Over the course of 3 years, they identified 7 potential infiltrators, preventing what could have been catastrophic discoveries of the network's operations. But their abilities came with a price that became more apparent as they grew older. The boys were increasingly isolated from other children who found their intense stays and whispered conferences unsettling. Adults in the community, while grateful for the protection the boys provided, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being constantly evaluated and judged. Even the most honest people felt uncomfortable under the Triplets' watchful eyes, knowing that every thought and emotion was somehow visible to them. Most troubling was the boys' growing awareness of their own abilities and the effect they had on others. By age 4, they had learned to modify their behavior around strangers, keeping their knowing looks subtle and their whispered consultations private. But this self-consciousness seemed to deepen their isolation, creating a barrier between them and the rest of the world that grew more pronounced with each passing year. The year 1860 brought changes to Cedar Mills that would test the Triplets' abilities in ways no one could have anticipated. The election of Abraham Lincoln had inflamed tensions throughout Ohio, and Underground Railroad activities were becoming increasingly dangerous. Federal marshals were conducting more frequent raids, and bounty hunters like the Garrett brothers were operating with virtual impunity. It was during this period of heightened danger that the boys, now 4 years old, began demonstrating a new and more disturbing aspect of their abilities. They could not only detect deception and hidden emotions in people who were present, they seemed to sense the emotional distress of people who were miles away. The first documented instance occurred on a bitter January morning when the Triplets suddenly became extremely agitated despite being safely inside the warm meeting house with their usual caregivers. All 3 boys began crying simultaneously, not the normal crying of upset children, but a keening wail that seemed to express profound terror and desperation. Martha Whitmore tried everything she could think of to calm them, but nothing worked. The boys continued their distressed crying for nearly 6 hours, finally falling silent just as the sun began to set. 2 days later, a freedom seeker arrived at the meeting house with devastating news. A group of 11 people, including 3 children, had been captured by slave catchers approximately 40 miles south of Cedar Mills. The capture had occurred at almost exactly the same time the triplets had begun their crying. Worse, the captured group B included a pregnant woman who had given birth during the attack. Both mother and child had died from exposure during the brutal journey back to Kentucky. Samuel Whitmore was shaken by this incident, but dismissed it as coincidence until it happened again 3 weeks later. This time, the boys' distress lasted only 2 hours, but was even more intense. When word arrived the following day, they learned that a conductor on the Underground Railroad had been shot and killed while helping a family escape near Portsmouth, Ohio. Again, at the exact time the triplets had begun showing signs of extreme distress, Dr. Harrison, who had been documenting the boys' development, was called to examine them after the 3rd such incident. His findings, recorded in his private notes, were deeply unsettling. During episodes of apparent long-distance distress sensing, the boys' pulse rates become synchronized, their breathing patterns identical, and their body temperatures drop by several degrees. Most remarkably, their brain activity appears to increase dramatically. They are clearly experiencing intense mental stimulation. Despite appearing outwardly distressed, I can only conclude that their nervous systems are somehow detecting emotional trauma occurring at great distances, though the mechanism by which this occurs is completely unknown to medical science. The boys' long-distance sensing abilities seem to be specifically attuned to situations involving deception, betrayal, and mortal danger. They never reacted to ordinary accidents or natural deaths, but they invariably detected when someone was being hunted, betrayed, or murdered. Their range appeared to extend throughout most of southern and central Ohio, and possibly into northern Kentucky. Word of the triplets' abilities spread beyond the Underground Railroad network. Families with missing loved ones began making pilgrimages to Cedar Mills, hoping that the boys could somehow sense whether their missing family members were still alive and where they might be found. Samuel Whitmore was reluctant to exploit the children's abilities in this way, but the boys themselves seemed drawn to these desperate families. The most remarkable case involved the Brennan family, whose 16-year-old daughter Mary had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Columbus. The girl had been missing for 3 months when her parents arrived in Cedar Mills, having heard rumors about 3 children who could find lost people. Samuel initially refused to involve the boys, but Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac approached the distraught parents on their own, without being asked. The triplets lined up in front of Mrs. Brennan and began their characteristic synchronized whispering. After several minutes, Isaac stepped forward and pointed southeast toward the Ohio River. "She's there," he said simply. "She's scared, but she's alive. The man who took her isn't who he said he was." Acting on this information, local authorities searched a remote farm near Chillicothe and found Mary Brennan locked in a cellar, along with 2 other young women who had been kidnapped by a man posing as a traveling preacher. The kidnapper was arrested and later confessed to planning to sell the women into prostitution in New Orleans. The rescue of Mary Brennan marked a turning point in how the community viewed the triplets. No longer were they simply children with an unusual ability to detect lies. They were becoming something else entirely, something that made even their Quaker guardians profoundly uncomfortable. The boys' abilities were growing stronger and more specific with each passing month, and there seemed to be no limit to their range or accuracy. But perhaps most disturbing was the boys' increasing emotional detachment from the world around them. The constant awareness of deception, violence, and human suffering was taking its toll. They rarely smiled, seldom played, and spent most of their time huddled together, whispering in their private language. When they did interact with adults, their conversations were marked by a wisdom and sadness that seemed impossible in children so young. Dr. Harrison, in his final notes about the boys before his death in 1862, wrote, "I fear that we are witnessing the emergence of human beings who are fundamentally different from the rest of our species. Their abilities appear to be expanding rather than stabilizing, and I cannot predict what they might become capable of as they mature. More troubling is the psychological cost of their gifts. These children are bearing witness to more human suffering and evil than most adults encounter in a lifetime, and they are doing so without the emotional defenses that adults develop over time. I do not know what kind of men they will become, but I fear they will be men apart from all others, forever isolated by their terrible knowledge of what lies hidden in the human heart." The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought unprecedented chaos to Ohio's Underground Railroad operations, but it also created new opportunities for the triplets to demonstrate the true extent of their extraordinary abilities. As Union and Confederate forces began moving through the border regions, the boys started exhibiting reactions to military activities that defied all logical explanation. Samuel Whitmore,